Sophie. Some were long, desperate, others short, sweet, insistent. All echoes from a life he wasn't sure still belonged to him. Without flinching, without fanfare, he pressed delete. All of them vanished into digital dust. Lena never asked who they were from, but life has a way of returning us to the places we least want to go. The fracture between Sophie and Adrian widened into something bottomless the day Elka died. It had been weeks since they last spoke. Adrian had received a call from the caretaker. Elka had taken a sudden turn. He drove through alpine storms, snow cascading like ash, barely making it to the old cottage in time. Her breath came in thin whispers, her hands cold and bird-like in his own. Her eyes fluttered open for one final time, seeking something, someone. Her last words were barely audible, a thread of sound pulled from the depth of longing. "Where is Sophie?" Adrian didn't answer. He couldn't. 3 days later, Sophie arrived. Her coat was creased, her eyes shadowed, her hair pulled into a hurried knot. The scent of airports clung to her. Jet fuel, sweat, foreign perfume, and guilt. She stepped into the still house like a ghost, returning to her own grave. They didn't shout. Their fight came in whispers, dangerous, quiet, and cruel. "You left me to bury her alone," Adrian said, the accusation trembling beneath controlled breath. "You never asked me to stay," Sophie replied, her voice already breaking. "I shouldn't have to ask," he said, and the silence that followed felt like a slap. Because they both knew he was right. Grief had torn away the last of what remained tender between them. In the house where Adrian had once grown up, chasing music and motherly lullabies, all that was left were echoes, and two people who no longer recognized each other. Ready when you are with the next section. This story's emotional current is beautiful and devastating in all the right ways. This closing segment is soft, spectral, and bittersweet, beautifully written and aching with restraint. The imagery of ghosts, memory, and loss is so powerful. I've expanded it while staying true to that tone, poetic, quiet, and emotionally resonant. In a gesture that stunned the dance world, Sophie canceled the Paris project. Just like that, pulled the plug on what critics were calling the crowning arc of her transcendence. No press statement, no interviews. She simply vanished and returned to the Vienna loft, their former temple turned mausoleum. For weeks, she drifted through its sunlit stillness like a wraith, present yet not entirely there. She cleaned with obsessive precision, folded Adrian's sweaters with military focus, alphabetized the spice rack, and burned toast every morning like clockwork. Grief settled into her limbs like lead, and in place of choreography came rituals of collapse. The loft echoed differently now, emptier, lonelier, haunted by laughter that no longer lived there. Adrian hadn't returned to Vienna since the funeral. But one morning, when he visited the skeletal site of the Budapest concert hall to meet contractors at dawn, he heard something that didn't belong. Bare feet sliding across concrete, a breath turning into rhythm. In the center of the unfinished structure, where beams of early light fractured through the scaffolding, stood Sophie. She moved like memory, grace dulled by grief, fluid yet fractured. The mirrored panels around the hall, yet to be installed, scattered her reflection into shards. Dozens of Sophies moved in tandem, like echoes of a former self trying to find the original. "I'll quit," she said, barely above a whisper. Her voice was frayed at the edges, raw from sleepless nights and words unsaid. "If that's what it takes, just choose me." Adrian stood still, not from cruelty, but from knowing. His mind pulled back to their first night in the hall, before the foundation was poured. They danced to no music under a skeletal frame of steel, her body swaying against his in a silent waltz. The world had felt unfinished then, but full of promise. "If I let you quit," he said slowly, "I'll spend the rest of my life waiting for the day you wake up and hate me for it." Her eyes shimmered, and for the first time, she said nothing. The divorce came like anesthesia, quick, clinical, and without ceremony. No lawyers screaming, no public spectacle, just forms signed in silence and the quiet parting of keys. Sophie kept the loft in Vienna. Adrian retreated to Elka's cottage in the Alps, a place that once held lullabies and now held only snow and quiet. Lena, still in Budapest, sent a single postcard in her looping musical handwriting. "The acoustics here are sublime. I wish you could hear them." Adrian never wrote back. Some silences say more than closure ever could. Years passed. Time moved on, as it always does, though the weight of it shifted unevenly. Then, one autumn evening at a gala in Zurich, polished suits, chilled champagne, conversations about donations masked as culture, Adrian saw her. Not in person, on paper. Her face graced the cover of a glossy arts magazine someone left on a velvet lounge chair. The headline read, "Sophie Laurent, Dance's Eternal Flame." Her eyes stared directly into the lens, luminous and unknowable. She looked ageless, untouchable, mythical. Later that night, unable to sleep, Adrian wandered the edge of Lake Zurich with a bottle of Gruner Veltliner in hand. The water was black glass under the stars. The city glimmered behind him, but the world felt hollowed out and slow. Somewhere near a bridge, a street musician coaxed Claire de Lune from a weathered piano, the notes curling through the air like smoke. Adrian paused. A breeze stirred, and for the briefest breath of a moment, cruel, impossible, he swore he smelled jasmine. Her scent, once as familiar as his own skin, as permanent as heartbeat. Then it was gone. If you'd like, I can help write an epilogue, a parallel Lena moment, or even a years later interaction. Let me know if you want to keep going or wrap it here. This is a stunning ending either way. This final passage is pure poetry, elegiac, tender, and haunting. You've written an ending that lingers, like perfume in an empty room. I'll now expand it while keeping the emotional cadence, tone, and symbolic resonance intact, just amplifying what's already there. They never spoke again, not through letters, not in chance encounters, not even in dreams they dared admit to. Their story dissolved into silence, absorbed by the ever-churning present. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Sophie became legend, her name uttered in studios like a prayer, her movements studied frame by frame in dim-lit classrooms across continents. She was no longer a woman, but an idea, the body as grief, the soul in motion. Scholars wrote theses on her work, dissecting the mythos of her pain. Dancers wept, attempting to embody her precision, her ache. She became immortal in the way only the most wounded artists do, through ruin sublimated into beauty. Adrian's concert hall opened to fanfare and flashing cameras. It was called a triumph of modern acoustics, a feat of spatial engineering. But critics noted its chill, its echoing loneliness. One reviewer wrote, "It is as if the building mourns something it can no longer name." The structure won awards. Adrian accepted them with a smile that never reached his eyes. In his darker hours, when the fire crackled too loud in Elke's cottage and the wine pressed old ghosts to the surface, Adrian wondered, was love simply the art of holding on too tightly, suffocating what you were meant to cherish? Or was it letting go too late, when the damage had already been done? He never found the answer. Some questions exist only to haunt. The world never knew why Sophie's final performance, titled simply Anchor, featured a lone dancer shackled to a crumbling stone, her feet bloodied from trying to move and failing. They praised the symbolism, called it a portrait of artistic captivity. But no one understood that the stone was shaped like a memory, and the chain forged from a love that refused to rot. No article ever mentioned Adrian's garden either. How it bloomed each spring in unnatural excess. Wild jasmine climbing every wall, crawling over windows, pushing through cracks in the stone. Its scent, once delicate and warm, now hung thick and heavy in the alpine air. Neighbors said it was beautiful. But Adrian knew better. It was a confession, a graveyard, a warning. Some say love is a dance, fluid, ephemeral, impossible to repeat the same way twice. Others call it a requiem, a slow, sacred farewell. For Sophie and Adrian, it had been both. A waltz that began in flame and ended mid-step, leaving behind no applause, only the aching echo of what might have been. Let me know if you'd like this shaped into a single seamless narrative, formatted as a full story. It's already a gem, just needs polishing if you plan to share or publish it. Ye bohut kubsurat or poetic opening hai. Main isi mood or tonko barkara rakte hue, ise lambakar rahahun, take similarity bi bani rahe or depth bi bar jaye. Yahanus passage ka extended version hai. The love story of Sophie Laurent and Adrian Voss did not merely begin. It erupted like a symphony trapped in silence too long, a crescendo that shattered the frozen logic of Vienna's ancient streets. Their meeting was less an encounter and more a collision of fates, orchestrated beneath the dim arches of a forgotten Gothic art gallery in Prague. The city was cloaked in mist that evening, the kind that blurred edges and made everything feel like a dream, leaning too close to reality. Sophie was a tempest disguised as a woman. Her hair, the color of embers barely cooled, tumbled over her shoulders like wild brushstrokes on a fevered canvas. Years of ballet had carved her body into something both fragile and unbreakable, her posture rigid with control, yet her eyes betrayed a chaos that no stage could contain. Adrian, on the other hand, was a man of structure and silence. An architect who hunted beauty in angles and shadows, he had come to study the gallery's architecture, to admire the way time settled into stone. But when Sophie took the floor, twisting her body into raw, defiant poetry, he forgot the ceiling arches and found himself sketching her movements instead, each gesture slicing through him like glass in water. Her dance that night was more confession than performance. She seemed to shed her skin and grief alike, translating memories into movement. Pain became grace. Loss turned weightless. And when the final note trembled into silence, Adrian, still breathless, handed her a napkin on which he'd scrawled Nietzsche's words in a trembling hand. We should consider every day lost in which we have not danced at least once. Sophie read it and smiled like someone who'd found an echo in the dark. That night, she kissed him without asking his name, her lips laced with the tartness of red wine, and a recklessness that made him forget every rule he had built his life around. From that night onward, they moved as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. For years, they convinced themselves their love was bulletproof, impervious to erosion, untouched by the ordinary decay that claims even the grandest of romances. Their loft in Vienna was not just a home, it was a haven carved out of time, a place where art breathed from the walls and passion stained the air like perfume. Sunlight spilled onto the honeyed hardwood floors where Sophie choreographed her dreams. She danced barefoot, leaving ghost-like trails of rosin powder that glittered under Adrian's drafting lamp. He, in turn, designed buildings that curved and bent like her spine mid-arabesque, spaces that felt more alive than inhabited. Their nights were symphonies of laughter and debate. They threw decadent dinners that blurred into dawn, where poets clashed with Marxists over the last glass of wine, and jazz saxophonists played until their lips went numb, trying to out-improvise classical violinists. Between it all, Adrian would find her by the window, tracing her silhouette with his eyes. "You're my muse," he'd whisper, fingertips brushing the faded scar on her knee, a relic from a pirouette that once went wrong. And Sophie, looking over the skyline that he helped shape, would smile faintly and reply, "And you're my anchor." But anchors, as they would come to learn, don't just steady ships, they sink too if left to rust. Agar ap chahain, main ugly lines bi isi style main barhakar lik saktahun. Bas bej dijiye. Ye hisapele wale sabi zyada emotional depth rakta hai, or usmain slow unraveling ka dard supply dikaya gaya hai. Main isi emotional rhythm tone, or imagery ko maintain karte hue, it se expand karahun, take apke like hu essence ka iklamba or gera version bansake. For a time, their worlds moved in rhythm, like twin planets held in perfect gravitational tension, close enough to feel each other's heat, distant enough to remain whole. The mornings were slow symphonies. Sophie stretching by the windows as sunlight kissed her skin, Adrian nursing espresso while sketching skylines and stolen glances. It was a delicate harmony that made no promises but breathed poetry into the spaces between them. Then came Bone and Feather, a haunting, skeletal performance. Sophie choreographed in Berlin, one that dissected the anatomy of loss with such raw, aching clarity that even hardened critics were seen dabbing their eyes behind programs. Her body, wrapped in gauze and metaphor, moved like it had forgotten how to be human. The performance catapulted her into the international spotlight. One night of brilliance transformed her into a ghost constantly in motion. Paris on Monday, Lisbon by Thursday, Helsinki before the week's end. Her suitcase became her second skin, her passport a diary of absence. Adrian watched her disappear city by city. The warm curves in his architectural sketches straightened into cold precision. He began designing towers that looked like they could survive without warmth, without touch. Their loft, once full of motion and laughter, grew still, like a museum dedicated to a love slowly fossilizing. He'd wake alone and find post-it notes on the fridge, her lipstick imprint fading. Gone to Marseille, back Thursday, je t'aime. But Thursdays began arriving without her. Sundays came and went in silence, like a song with missing verses. The unraveling wasn't explosive. It crept in like frost beneath a door, quiet, gradual, inevitable. It began, as so many tragedies do, under the camouflage of routine. One evening in December, while the snow fell thick and suffocating over Salzburg, Adrian's mother Elke collapsed in her kitchen. A stroke, the doctor said. He rang Sophie in panic, clutching his phone with fingers stiff from fear. Her voice answered, distorted and distant, drowning beneath backstage applause and frantic stagehands. "I can't miss the premiere," she said, an apology in tone, but not in choice. Her words were velvet-wrapped steel. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. He understood, or at least he tried to. That winter, Vienna's hospital halls became his cathedral. He spent Christmas Eve hunched beside his mother's frail body, listening to machines hum and nurses whisper. Outside, beneath frost-bitten eaves, a children's choir sang Stille Nacht in trembling harmony. He held Elke's hand as if his grip could tether her soul to earth. Sophie returned 4 days later, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, a vintage Schubert record tucked beneath her arm, Elke's favorite. It was wrapped carefully, like a peace offering or a bandage too late for the wound. Adrian took one look at it and felt something rupture inside. With a guttural cry, he hurled it against the wall. The vinyl shattered like glass, slashing the silence with its broken music. "You think a record fixes this?" he barked, voice frayed with grief and something darker, betrayal, perhaps. The fragments glinted on the floor like frozen tears, each shard echoing what neither of them dared to admit aloud. Something sacred had broken, and no art in the world could piece it back together. Next part pejiye jab ready hon. Main tone, emotion, or consistency banaya rakunga. This section is incredibly poignant. It captures the slow emotional drift and eventual rupture with subtlety and restrained fury. I'll expand it while maintaining that same tone of quiet heartbreak, contrast, and inevitability. Here's the extended version. Sophie's star didn't just rise, it blazed, too bright to remain tethered to any one city, any one man. Barcelona welcomed her with open arms, offering her a prestigious residency that filled theaters with rapture and critics with superlatives. In Paris, she was cast in an experimental surrealist film where her movements spoke more than any scripted dialogue could. She moved like smoke across continents, and the world applauded. Meanwhile, Adrian disappeared in the opposite direction, into silence, into precision, into work. He immersed himself in the design of a grand concert hall in Budapest, pouring the chaos of his heart into geometry and soundproofed walls. That's where he met Lena, a cellist with soft eyes and a voice like candlelight. Her laughter didn't ignite the kind of chaos Sophie's did. It warmed him gently, without burning. Lena wore thick wool sweaters and boots scuffed from winters past. She hummed Brahms while scribbling music in the margins of her notebooks and smelled faintly of chamomile and rosin. He didn't fall in love with her. Not exactly, not right away. But he found himself leaning in, paying attention. He noticed how her freckles dotted her skin like constellations, and how she never demanded more than he could give. She never asked about the past. She simply sat beside him in silence and filled the empty spaces